The fire did not roar. It was silent. The old saloon burned like paper, quickly, neatly, almost silently. The walls collapsed inward with a dull sigh, sending up a column of sparks, and the crowd retreated. Then they surged forward again. May Holloway didn't move. She stood 20 paces from the fire, short, wearing a man's overcoat that didn't fit, holding a sheaf of papers in her left hand. Her face was clean, though all of Harlan County had been covered in soot that night. She'd washed herself before going out. That, too, had been part of the plan. Sheriff Ballard stood 3 steps away from her, his legs spread wide. 2 deputies stood nearby carrying flashlights. One nervously twirled his baton. The other looked off to the side where Hackett stood at the edge of the crowd. Clayton Hackett was wearing a fine broadcloth coat. It cost about $40 in Lexington, more than most families in these mountains spent on clothing in a year. Next to him stood a young man in glasses carrying a leather briefcase, a lawyer. Hackett stepped forward. The crowd parted, not because he asked, but because they were used to it. Miss Holloway. His voice was the kind you might use with children or dogs, not angry but condescending. This land is worth $30,000. Do you realize what you're holding in your hands? May looked at him. A child at the edge of the crowd babbled something and was pressed against his mother's shoulder. The fire behind May settled with a quiet crackle. "I know," she said. 2 words, no explanation. Hackett narrowed his eyes. The lawyer opened his briefcase and closed it again, the gesture of a man whose conversation had gone off script. Sheriff Ballard cleared his throat. "Girl," he said wearily, "it's 3 in the morning. Maybe in the morning like a normal person." "The property has already burned down, Sheriff, and I have the papers with me." She held up the bundle, not dramatically, just so they could see. The rope she'd tied them with 3 weeks ago was tied in a tight double knot. "I've thought about this scene for a long time. An 18-year-old girl, homeless 4 months ago, stands before a sheriff, a landowner, and a lawyer and refuses to back down. You could call it stubbornness. You could call it desperation. But I think the right word is clarity. A person with nothing to lose sees things clearly." To understand how May Holloway ended up here, with these papers, on this night, we have to go back 4 months. To a gray September morning in 1923, when she stood by the road in Harlan City with 2 coins in her palm. She had just turned 18. The Dorsets, her foster family, had put her things out on the porch before breakfast. Mrs. Dorset explained briefly, "The state pays for a child until 18, not a day longer." She wasn't an evil woman, just practical. The canvas bag contained little: a change of clothes, a Bible with the first pages torn out, a comb with 2 broken teeth, and $2, the money saved from 3 years of working in the kitchen. Nothing else. She found Harlan City by chance. The farmer giving her a ride was heading there. It was the first time she'd seen mountains. The sky here was small, squeezed between the ridges, and for some reason, it was comforting. Less space to get lost. She saw the auction notice on the post office board. Most of the lots didn't interest her. Lot number 14 was printed with official indifference. Wooden structure, 1 room, 0.4 acre lot, Cumberland Mountain, northeast slope. Starting price, $2.00. Beneath it, in pencil, someone had written, "This is Bad Dick's cabin. No bidders." May took the notice off the wall and put it in her pocket. At the auction, when they reached lot number 14, the auctioneer read out the bidding list without expression and asked, "Who goes first?" No one raised their hand. He waited. Then he asked again. $2, May said. Someone laughed. Not loudly, but audible. She walked up to the table, put down the coins, and took the stamped receipt. At the gate, Hackett's man caught up with her. "Sell it to me for a $5. You'll come out on top." May refused and continued on. Behind her she heard, "The town idiot, she'll be back in a week." I'm always amazed by this certainty that a person without money will inevitably break quickly. Hackett lived his life among people he himself broke. He probably just didn't know any other option. It was 8 miles uphill to the cabin. The last 2 were pathless. May arrived at sunset. What she saw could hardly be called a home. The roof had collapsed. The 4th wall was half collapsed. The floor had rotted black. But the rocky outcrop on which the cabin stood had been cleverly chosen, above any floodwater, with a view in 3 directions. She noticed this immediately, without yet understanding why. A smell hit me inside. Mold, rotten wood, and a subtle, almost unnoticeable scent, hidden behind everything else. Machine oil, old but not weathered. May looked around. On the floor was a finger's-thick layer of dust, mouse tracks, an old shell casing. And, she leaned over, a brass button with an anchor. She put it in her pocket. She lay down against the wall, wrapped in a blanket. Half a meter away, beneath the rotten floorboards, lay what would change the lives of 14 families and destroy the fortune Hackett had spent 20 years building. She simply fell asleep. For the first time in months, under her own roof. In the morning, the hut looked worse than at night. Daylight revealed what the darkness had mercifully concealed. The lower logs of the north wall had been eaten away by rot, halfway through the thickness of the logs. The floor in the center of the room gave way beneath footsteps with a soft, alarming crunch, like ice at the beginning of a thaw. Through a hole in the roof, the sky was visible, gray, low, with the scent of approaching rain. May walked around the outside of the hut, counting. 3 good logs, 1 needed replacing. The roof, at least 12 boards. The window, there was no glass and never had been, so burlap would be used until winter. Then they'd figure something out. The stove was still there, stone, old masonry with a crack along the right side, but the chimney was intact. That was the main thing. She wrote on the back of the auction receipt with a stub of pencil found in a crack between the logs. The list was long. There was no money at all. Voices were heard from the path. 2 men were climbing the slope, the Crown brothers, Edgar and Luther, whose farms stood in the lowlands below the ridge. May had seen them at the auction. Edgar was the elder, stocky, with a red beard like a shovel. Luther was the younger, skinny, with the perpetual squint of a man staring at the sun or something funny. They stopped 10 paces away. Luther looked at the hut with the expression one might have at a bad joke. "So it's true," said Edgar. Not a question, but a statement. "I bought it." "I bought it," May said. "For $2. For $2. Luther spat on the ground. "Girl, Evil Dick lived here for 11 years, alone, in the mountains." He paused, letting her feel it. "People say he died here before they hanged him. Do you understand what I mean?" "No," May said. "This place is hopeless." "The place is dry," she answered, "and above the flood level." The brothers exchanged glances. Edgar shook his head with the air of a man who had done all he could. "It's your business," he said. "Just don't expect anyone to come help." They walked down the path. May heard Luther's voice now from a distance. "City girl, she'll be gone in a month." She didn't run away. She went for boards. Half a mile down the slope stood an abandoned barn. The roof had long since caved in, but the walls were still standing. May had spent the entire day there, pulling out nails, dismantling boards, and lugging them up 3 or 4 at a time, slinging them with rope over her shoulder. By evening, her hands were covered in splinters and small cuts. Her palms smelled of rusty iron. Widow Esther Pine lived a quarter mile to the west, the only inhabited house on this part of the mountain. She appeared on the trail around 4, carrying a bundle, and silently placed it at the door of the cabin. Bread and boiled potatoes, still warm. "No need," May said. "I know," Esther said. "I didn't ask." She was about 60 years old, small, dry, with hands accustomed to work. She looked at May without pity or mockery, simply as one looks at something interesting to watch. "Did you read what was written about this place in the auction papers?" she asked. "It says unsatisfactory condition," May said. "And nothing else?" "And nothing more." Esther was silent for a second. Then she nodded to herself and walked back down the path. She didn't explain. May watched her go, thinking, this woman knew something she hadn't said. She remembered that feeling. Ronald D. Chalfont's study, Harlan County and Illustrated History, 1981, briefly mentions that the northeastern slope of Cumberland was considered unfit for agricultural use at the turn of the century, an official statement that usually meant one of two things. Either the land was truly worthless, or someone desperately wanted it to be thought so. May, of course, hadn't read that book. But she asked the same question, just in different terms. On the third day, while nailing the first patch onto the roof, she noticed something strange. The floor, in the northeast corner where the smell of machine oil was strongest, was laid differently than the rest. Most of the planks ran lengthwise across the hut from east to west. All but one. One plank in the corner was laid crosswise. The grain of the wood ran the other way. May stood over her and stood silently. Then she went up to the roof and continued working. But the thought remained. I think she was right not to go straight in. A person who finds something unusual and immediately rushes to investigate often does so in front of witnesses. By that point, May already understood. In these mountains, the walls had ears. That evening, a man in a brown suit came up the path from below. The same man from the auction, Hackett's representative. He carried a piece of paper. "Mr. Hackett is offering you $20 for this property," he said, handing over the sheet. "That's a fair price considering the condition of the building." "I'm not selling," May said. "Miss, $20 is 10 times more than you paid 3 days ago." "I know arithmetic." He paused. He looked at the hut, at the holes in the roof, at the collapsed wall, at the stack of crooked boards by the threshold. "People are shaking their heads, Miss Holloway. I just want you to understand that." "I understand," she said. "Good night." He left. May watched him go, thinking about one thing. Hackett had raised the price from $5 to $20 in 3 days. People don't raise prices for no reason. So this place is worth something. He knows what. She didn't know yet. But that night, lying by the wall, she heard the sky rumble dully somewhere far to the north, beyond the ridge. Not thunder, something else. Heavy and leisurely, as if the mountain were breathing. The first signs of high water appeared where no one was looking for them. The rain came on the 4th night, not gradually but suddenly, full force from the ridge, as if someone had overturned a huge trough. May woke to the sound. Water was pouring through a hole in the roof right into the middle of the floor, collecting in a puddle that slowly spread toward the northeast corner. She stood up, moved the bag further away, wrapped herself in a blanket, and began to watch. The water drained quickly into the corner, too quickly for a level floor. She picked up the candle, lit it, and brought it closer. In the flickering yellow circle of light, she could see the puddle pooling precisely where that crossboard had been. It sank into the crack and vanished. It didn't soak into the wood, it sank down beneath the decking. May put the candle on the stove and lay back down. She didn't sleep until the morning. She listened to the rain. There was enough work to last a week, and the tools she had were an axe with a cracked handle, found under the floor near the stove, and a knife. She ran out of money the day after the auction, She spent her last cents on salt and matches at a store just outside Harlan City. She hauled roofing boards from an abandoned barn, 3 or 4 at a time, uphill through the scree. On the 5th day, the axe handle cracked completely. She wrapped it with a leather sack strap and tightened it with a wet one. It would dry and fit tighter. It held. She straightened the nails on the stone, old rusty ones, made from the same barn boards. It took time, but there was no other choice. By evening, her hands would stop working, not from pain, but simply from the strength in her fingers running out. Then she would sit by the stove, warm her palms, and count. How many boards were left? How many were needed? How many nails for each? On the 6th day, Esther Pine brought a piece of boiled pork and beans in a tin. She placed them by the door. May no longer said, "No need." "How's it going?" Esther asked. "Slowly." "Roof?" "A third remains." Esther looked at May's hands, at the splinters, the calluses, the abrasion across her right palm, and said nothing. She just nodded. "Richard Murphy fixed this roof every fall," she said quietly, already leaving. "He said, a mountain roof isn't for life, it's for one season, every time anew." May raised her head. "You knew him?" "Everyone knew," Esther said, and she walked along the path without looking back. The Crown brothers showed up again on the 8th day, unannounced, just passing by on their own business and stopping to stare. Luther squinted at the patched roof. "Listen, Edgar," he said, not lowering his voice. "She also uses bent nails. See?" "I see," Edgar said. "The first snow, and all this will fly off." "Well." May nailed the board and didn't turn around. "Miss," Edgar said louder, "do you realize that in winter it can get down to -20 here? For real, not like in the city." "I understand," May said. "And you will stay?" "I'm planning to." Luther chuckled. They stood there for a moment longer and then left. From the path May heard, "Stubborn." And there wasn't anger in Edgar's voice, but something closer to surprise. On the 9th day the roof was finished. May climbed down, stood below, and looked. It looked uneven, patch upon patch, boards of different widths, nails sticking out at different angles. But it held. She went inside and looked from below. There were no cracks. The sky wasn't visible. She gave herself 5 minutes to sit by the stove doing nothing. Exactly 5. Then she took a knife and went to the northeast corner. The smell of machine oil was more noticeable here than anywhere else in the hut. She checked it on the 2nd day, methodically, crawling across the floor and sniffing, which would have looked odd to any observer. But there were no observers. The smell was stronger near the northeast corner, and especially near that crossbar. She knelt over it and ran her fingers along the edge. The gap was slightly wider than the adjacent boards, not by much, about 3 millimeters. But there was no dust along the edge of the board, none at all. On all the other boards, the dust lay in a thick gray layer. It was clean here, as if the board had been lifted, a long time ago, but it had been lifted. May inserted the knife into the gap and pressed. The board didn't give in. She tried the other end. Same thing. It held, but not as if it were nailed down, more like it was pushed in. She moved the knife a third of the way from the end, pressed, and felt something shift slightly. It gave a millimeter and then settled in place. A shutter slammed behind the wall, the wind. May put away her knife and straightened up. The window revealed a slope, empty, gray with pine undergrowth. No one there. I think she did the right thing by stopping, not because she was cowardly. Cowardice has nothing to do with it. It's just that a person who finds something under the floor of someone else's hut and immediately starts digging does so with the door open. May closed the door first, literally and figuratively. That night she stuffed moss into the cracks in the doorframe to keep out the draft, she would have explained to anyone who asked. She hung a second layer of burlap over the window. Then she lay down and listened to the mountain. The wind was blowing from the north now, cold, with a scent she was beginning to recognize. Not rain, something heavier. Old Esther Pine had told her the day before, "When the north smells of iron, it means a big water is gathering. Remember the rivers in the hollows, they'll be the first to tell." May didn't know then that the high water was less than 2 weeks away, but she encountered the rivers the next morning, and she didn't like the rivers. On the 10th day, the first 3 drops of rain fell from the sky and immediately stopped. May stood on the porch and looked at the sky. It was the color of old copper, low, dense, without a single break. The wind had died down overnight and hadn't risen. This wasn't right. There's always wind in the mountains. She went back inside, closed the door, take out a knife. The board gave way on the second try. It wasn't because May pressed harder, she'd simply found the right spot. 7 inches from the north edge, where the wood had sagged slightly with age. She inserted the knife, pressed down, felt the shift, and the board lifted up whole, like a lid, without a single nail. It was held in place by 2 wooden dowels inserted into the grooves from below. Clever work. It wasn't a carpenter's doing. It was someone who wanted to open it themselves, quickly and without tools. There was earth beneath the board, and in the earth was a depression the size of a small chest, lined around the edges with flat stones. Carefully, patiently, there was a bundle in the recess. May didn't touch it right away. She brought the candle closer and examined it. On the outside was oilcloth, wrapped several times, the edges coated with something dark and hardened. Resin. Beneath the oilcloth, the corners of a metal box could be discerned. She ran her fingers around its perimeter. It was cool, with no traces of rust where the resin held the seam. Whoever hid this, hid it for a long time. May pulled out the package, placed it on the floor, and unfolded the oilcloth. It was a tin box, military style, with a simple latch lock. The lock was oiled. It opened without a sound. Inside, wrapped in an oiled rag, was a Colt pistol, 1894, in good condition. And underneath it, a bundle of papers, tied with a leather cord. May put the gun down and picked up the papers. She read by candlelight until dark, and then in the dark, lighting a second one when the first burned out. The papers were written in a single hand, the large, confident handwriting of someone who didn't write often, but when he did, he knew what he wanted to say. The ink had faded to brown, but everything was legible. The first was 4 map sheets, a mountainous region for 40 miles around, drawn with a precision that would have defied a casual observer. Trails, streams, elevation marks, property lines. Each property had a cross and a number. May counted 23 crosses. The second is 14 receipts, written in the same format. I, the undersigned, have received from Richard Murphy the sum of $, for a term of 3 years, secured by a parcel of land of acres, located. The dates are all 1911. All 14 signatures are different. The amounts range from $20 to $110. Small amounts. The kind of money you take in a year of famine when you have no one else to borrow from. The third is a letter, 1 page. No address, no date. Whoever finds this, May read, hasn't found gold. They've found debts. I know what you're thinking. Why would I want someone else's debt? But read the receipts carefully. The land was collateral. The people didn't pay back the money, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. The drought burned everything in sight in 12. By Kentucky law, the collateral goes to the holder of the receipt. I'm the holder. I was. Now you are. Hackett bought up these debts from the people I lent money to for 10 cents on the dollar while they were starving. He thought I had the papers. He thought wrong. The papers are here. I'm no bandit. I know what they say about me, but what they hanged me for isn't what I did. You may not believe me. Check the trial dates and the dates of the stagecoach attack. I was somewhere else. This a witness, Esther Pine. She knows. Do with it what you will. But know this, these families lost their land not because they were bad farmers, because they were unlucky with the year. R. Murphy. May dropped the letter onto her lap. It was quiet outside. That special mountain silence that comes before a big weather change, when the birds are silent and the wind hasn't yet begun to blow. The candle burned evenly, without flickering. Harry Cora's 1978 study, Land and Power in Appalachia, describes precisely this scheme. During the drought years of the turn of the century, small lenders in Kentucky's mountainous counties deliberately purchased debt securities from the original holders, often for a pittance, and then laid claim to the land. The law was on their side. Murphy knew it. And he hid the papers before he was arrested. May reread the letter again, then the receipts, all 14 of them, one after another. Then she looked at the cards. The crosses on the maps stood exactly where the mortgaged plots were. 23 crosses, 14 mortgaged plots, and 9 more. What the other 9 meant, she didn't yet know. She put everything back, wrapped it in an oiled cloth, and closed the box. But she didn't put it under the floor. She placed it behind the stove, under a stone. I think she made a decision that night without even realizing it. Not the decision about what to do with the papers, but another, simpler and more important one. Not to be afraid. An 18-year-old girl, alone in the mountains, had just discovered she was holding someone else's war in her hands. And she didn't run away. That, in my opinion, is the true moment where the story begins. She did not sleep until dawn. When it began to grow gray outside, she got up, washed her face with cold water from a bucket, and went to Esther Pine. Esther opened the door before May could knock. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Did you find it?" "Found it." Esther stepped aside to let her in. There was already a teapot on the table. "Sit down," said the old woman. "This will be a long conversation." Esther spoke for an hour, maybe more. May sat across from her at the table, holding her mug in both hands and listening. She didn't interrupt. She knew how to listen so that people would say everything they knew, not just what they'd decided to say. Esther had known Murphy for 20 years. He was her neighbor, not close but reliable. The kind of man who doesn't meddle in other people's lives, but shows up precisely when you need him. During the drought of 11, he went around the mountain farms and lent money to those who otherwise wouldn't have survived the winter. Not like a bank, no interest, no pressure. The collateral was a formality required by the law, not by himself. He knew Hackett was eyeing this land, Esther said, looking out the window. The northern coal companies were already buying up everything they could. Hackett was their man here. He bought for pennies and resold for more. Richard knew that if the mortgage papers fell into Hackett's hands, the families would lose the land. That's why he hid them. And the arrest? Esther was silent. In February of 12, there was a stagecoach robbery near Pineville. Richard was here. I saw him myself that same day, morning and evening. But the witness in court said otherwise. She turned to May. The witness worked for Hackett. Everyone knew it. No one said it out loud. May put the mug on the table. Why are you telling me this? Esther looked at her straight. Because you found the box. That means he chose you. He didn't know I existed. He wrote, "The one who finds it." You found it. She shrugged, like someone for whom that was a perfectly adequate explanation. I waited 11 years. I thought maybe no one would ever buy this place. Hackett made sure no one did. I don't know how you slipped in." May remembered the auction. Hackett, the man in the brown suit, who hadn't raised a hand to bid on lot number 14. Apparently, he'd decided there was no point in spending $2 on something no one wanted anyway. One mistake in 20 years. But it was worth everything. Hackett arrived the next day, in person, without the man in the brown suit, with the lawyer from Lexington, the one with the glasses. They walked up the path together, and May saw them from the window beforehand. She tucked the box deeper under the rock behind the stove. She went out onto the porch and waited. Hackett stopped 5 steps away. He looked at the repaired roof, at the remaining boards neatly stacked against the wall, at May, and something in his expression changed slightly. Not fear, more like a recount. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I see you're settling in." "Trying." "That makes sense." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out. "I have an offer for you. $50 for this property, net, today." May took the paper and unfolded it, a standard sales contract already filled out. The amount was $50. The date was today. At the bottom was a space for her signature. She returned the sheet. "No, thank you." Hackett didn't take the paper back immediately. He held it between them for a second, as if giving her time to reconsider. "Miss Holloway, do you realize that repairing this building will cost you more than $50? "I'm coping for now." The lawyer stepped forward. His voice was even and well-trained, the voice of a man who had been trained to sound persuasive. "Ms. Holloway, I need to brief you. We've researched the history of this property. Richard Murphy was convicted of a felony in 1912. Under Kentucky law, the property of a convicted felon is vested in the county. The auction house sold you the structure, but not the rights to any documents or assets that may be located within. Such assets, if they exist, legally belong to the county." He paused. "That is, to us." May listened to him without changing her expression. "It's a clever trick to tell someone that what they've found doesn't belong to them, even before they've said they've found it. The lawyer didn't know if there was anything valuable in the cabin. He was bluffing. May realized it, and didn't show it. I think that was one of the most important moments in the whole story." "Interesting," she said. "I'll buy a copy of the Kentucky Code in town and look into it." The lawyer narrowed his eyes slightly. "You have 1 week, Miss Holloway," Hackett said. His voice became a little quieter and a little colder, that intonation that needs no explanation. "The offer still stands. Then I withdraw it." They walked down the path, May watching them go. A week. So, in a week, he'll do something else. File papers in court, press the sheriff, find another way. She knew this as surely as she knew that a crookedly driven nail would eventually come out. That evening she went to Esther and told her about the conversation. Esther listened silently, her hands folded on the table. "The lawyer's lying," she said finally. "Partially. Richard's property was indeed seized, the livestock, the tools, the money that was in the house. But the IOUs aren't his property. They're other people's obligations to him. That's a different section of the law. The county can't seize someone else's debt." "Do you know this for sure?" "My husband was a justice of the peace for 20 years, Esther smiled slightly. "I heard something at dinner." May looked at her. "Esther, why didn't you get these papers yourself? For 11 years you knew about the box?" The old woman was silent. "I had a hunch, but I didn't buy the cabin. It wasn't mine." She stood up and went to the window. "Besides, Hackett was keeping an eye on this place. If I'd gone in there myself, he'd have found out, and the papers would have disappeared. I needed someone he wouldn't be expecting." Outside the window, the northern sky was dark yellow, an unpleasant clay-like color. Esther stared at it for a long time. "Do you hear?" she said quietly. May listened. At first, nothing. Then, far away in the lowlands, a barely audible sound. Rivers. They spoke differently than yesterday. Louder, faster. "How much time do we have?" May asked. "Until the high water?" Esther turned away from the window. 10 days, maybe less." That night, May didn't go home. She stayed with Esther, where they sat over Murphy's maps until midnight. May had 4 days left before Hackett's deadline, and 10 before the roads would be under water. She started counting. The dawn of October 16th was the color of copper. Not the warm copper hue you get over the ridges in clear weather in autumn. It was different, dull, almost dirty, as if the sun was rising through a layer of dust that wasn't there. May stepped out onto the porch at 5 in the morning and immediately felt the air was still, completely still. Not the slightest movement, not above, not below, not even along the slope. Such things don't happen in the mountains. Then came the sound. Not thunder, she would have recognized thunder. This sound was lower and more even, a dull, drawn-out rumble, coming not from the sky but from the ground, from beneath her feet, as if the spine itself were humming from within. She stood on the porch and listened, and the rumble grew, slowly, inexorably, like the surf you hear before you see the sea. Then she saw water. First in the lowlands. The stream beneath the western slope, which she saw from her window every morning, a narrow thread of water between rocks, suddenly widened. In the few minutes she watched, it doubled in size, then again, brown, swift, with wisps of foam and branches in the flow. Then it overflowed its banks. The water flowed down the ravine, first in a thin layer, then deeper. It covered the lower path before May could even cross it. Then it reached the Crown Brothers' vegetable plots. May could see them from here, from the ledge. 2 neat strips of tilled land at the foot of the slope, already covered in a murky film of water. Then the water reached the road. The only dirt road from Harlan City to the mountainous region ran along the bottom of a ravine. It was more convenient and smoother. Now this had become its main drawback. The road was covered in water within an hour. First puddles, then ankle-deep floodwater. Then May could no longer see the road itself, only guessing its direction by the tops of roadside posts sticking out of the water. A Lexington lawyer is stuck on the other side. She didn't realize it right away. The thought came calmly, like a simple arithmetic fact. If the road is closed, no one will come. Not the lawyer, not Hackett, not the court. The 1-week deadline just became meaningless. By midday, the water had risen another foot. 2 of Hackett's barns at the bottom of the valley, large, well-built, tin-roofed ones, were waist-deep in water. May could see them from the ledge. One had tilted over by midday and landed on its side with a dull splash, raising a wave. The other held, but everything inside was clearly flooded. The farms in the lowlands were silent. There was no smoke to be seen. Either the furnaces had flooded or the people had moved higher. May didn't know. The trail to Esther Pine was still dry. The old widow lived on the western ledge, just above Murphy's cabin. May reached it at noon. Esther stood by the window with the same calm expression with which she had probably met every such flood during her 60 years of living in the mountains. "Big," May said. "Not the most." Esther nodded toward the window. "It was taller in 5, and in 87, they say. I didn't see it, I was too small." Historian Thomas D. Clark, in his monograph, A History of Kentucky, 1937, described exactly these floods in Harlan County as a cyclical phenomenon with a period of 18 to 22 years. Each time they cut off the mountainous areas from the city for 3 to 10 days, and each time those whose buildings stood in the hollows suffered the most. Murphy lived there for 11 years. He witnessed exactly one such flood. And he chose the site for his cabin exactly as one chooses with knowledge. "The road's closed for about 5 days," Esther said. "Maybe 7. Hackett won't get through. And his lawyer, too." She looked at May. "You're thinking about the paperwork." "Think." "You're right. But you won't get to court either. So we'll get ready while he can't interfere." Murphy's hut stood dry. May returned in the evening and circled the ledge. The ground was damp and water trickled at the base of the cliff, but it didn't reach the porch. The ledge rose about 20 feet above the hollow, just right. No more, no less. Murphy had measured precisely. She went inside. She took the box from behind the stove. She laid the cards out on the floor, all 4 sheets, end to end, so she could see them all. She picked up a pencil stub. She already knew 14 mortgaged plots from the receipts. Now she marked them on the map one by one, checking the descriptions. Such and such a stream, such and such a slope. The boundary with the road. The work took 2 hours. When she finished, she saw the whole picture. 14 plots formed a nearly continuous strip along the northeastern ridge. Not a random scattering, a strip. As if someone had deliberately chosen these lands precisely here. She looked at the remaining 9 crosses. They stood within this strip. Not in isolated areas, but right on the slopes, in places that on the map weren't anyone's property. Just mountain slopes. May looked at these crosses for a long time. Then she put the cards away, lay down, and closed her eyes. Outside, the water in the ravine hummed steadily and powerfully, like a living creature in no hurry. I'm convinced it was that night that she understood about the 9 crosses. Not right away, gradually, almost in her sleep. But she kept silent. She didn't even talk about it with Esther right away. May Holloway was one of those people who think first and then speak. In her situation, this wasn't just a matter of character, it was a defense. At dawn, a sound came from the direction of the flooded path. At first, she thought a tree had fallen into the water. Then she listened. No, it was a knocking sound, a fist pounding a board, hurried and desperate. Someone was walking on the water, knocking on everything above the flood level. May opened the door. On the trail, knee-deep in muddy water, stood Luther Crown, the youngest of the brothers. Soaking wet, hatless, with the kind of face people only wear when they have nowhere else to go. "The house below was washed away," he said. "Edgar and his family are sitting in the attic. The water is chest-deep below." May stepped aside. "Come in, warm up first." Luther warmed up in half an hour. May gave him dry socks, the only spare item she had, and poured him boiling water with dried mint she'd found in a crack between the stove stones during the first week. He sat by the fire holding his mug and remained silent. It wasn't the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who doesn't know how to begin. "Edgar built a house in the lowlands 30 years ago," he said finally. "My father built it back then. It never flooded like this." "It flooded," May said, "in year 5, and before." Luther looked at her. "You've been here for less than a year," Esther told. He paused, looking into the mug. "We need to get Edgar out of the attic. The water's chest deep down there, and the children are there. 3 children." "No boat?" "It was washed away along with the barn." May stood up, put on her shoes, and grabbed a rope, a long skein that she had found in an abandoned barn during her first week, and dragged up without any specific purpose, simply because a good rope always comes in handy in the mountains. "Let's go." They pulled Edgar and his family out by midday. May tied the rope to an elm tree on the ledge and dropped it down the slope. It was long enough to reach the attic window. The children went first, then Edgar's wife with a bundle of belongings, then Edgar himself, big, heavy, unaccustomed to being helped. He stood on the ledge and looked down at his house, the roof jutting out of the water like a whale's back, and was silent for a long time. Then he turned to May. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Once, briefly. She nodded back. By evening, 7 people had gathered on the ledge. They came in ones and twos, those whose houses stood in the lowlands. The Pratt family, husband, wife, and elderly mother. Widower Silas Horn with his 2 teenage sons. The young Kettering couple, she pregnant, he with a bandaged hand, cut while hauling out the cattle. All were wet, all had the same expression, the confusion that people hide behind business-like manners, behind talk of practical matters. The hut was small. May carried out everything unnecessary, boards, tools, and a supply of firewood, and stacked it against the wall under the shelter. Inside, she positioned the people close to the stove. It was cramped and warm. Esther Pine arrived uninvited, carrying a large bundle, grains, corned beef, 2 onions, and a cast-iron pot. She walked silently to the stove, shouldered Luther Crown aside, and began cooking. No one objected. That night, when the children were asleep in a heap near the stove and the adults were talking in low voices, May took out the box. She hadn't planned to do this so soon. But Esther looked at her over the heads of the crowd and nodded slightly. May realized there would be no better moment. "I need to show you something," she said. The conversation died down. She spread the receipts on the floor, all 14 of them. She listed the names, Crown, Pratt, Horn, Kettering, and 10 more families who weren't here but whose farms also stood in these mountains. The silence was complete. Edgar Crown was the first to take his receipt, carefully with 2 fingers, as if picking up something fragile. "It's Murphy's hand," he said quietly. "I recognize it." "Me too," said Mrs. Pratt. May explained, briefly without further ado. The notes were written to Murphy, not the bank or the county. Murphy hid them before he was arrested. Under Kentucky law, a lien on a note holder that isn't filed within 10 years of the holder's death passes to the first person to produce the original document. Murphy died in 1912. 1911 had passed. "Hackett bought up your debts," she continued, "for 10 cents on the dollar. He thought he had all the rights, but he bought copies, or counterfeits. The originals are here." Silas Horn looked at her with the expression one has when one looks at a person who speaks English, but the words form something incomprehensible. "Wait," he said slowly. "Are you saying that our debts are now yours?" "Technically, yes," May said. "I'm the holder of the originals." The silence became different, heavier. "I understand this reaction. People just learned that one owner has changed hands, and the new owner sits before them in a patched coat and states it calmly, as if it were a fact. The fear hasn't gone away, he's just changed his address." May sensed it, and that's why she said the following. "I'm not Hackett," she said. "I'm not going to collect debts or take the land. But I need you to understand this. As long as I have the originals, Hackett can't make any claim to your plots. Not through the courts, not through the county, nothing. Because his papers are secondary. Mine are primary." Edgar Crown looked up. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing yet." May folded the receipts back. "First, we'll survive the flood. Then we'll talk about what's next." Esther Pine stirred her porridge by the stove, silent. But May noticed. The old woman was smiling faintly, just the corners of her lips so no one could see. The flood subsided on the 5th day. The water receded slowly. First the tops of the roadside posts appeared, then the roofs of the barns, then the road itself, muddy, broken, with holes as tall as a man. People descended the ledge in silence, examining what remained of the houses below. Edgar Crown stood at his threshold, ankle-deep in mud, looking at the torn floorboards, the layer of silt on the floor, the leaning wall. May stood nearby. "We'll rebuild," Edgar said, not to her but to himself, or just out loud. "You'll rebuild," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You stayed dry. I saw your hut, not a drop of water." Murphy chose the place. Murphy was a smart man, Edgar said quietly, without malice, but with that special respect one has for the dead when they've been proven right. The next morning the road was cleared enough for walking. That same day a man in a brown suit appeared from the direction of Harlan City, dirty to the knees, angry. Behind him a bespectacled lawyer without a briefcase. The briefcase apparently hadn't survived the journey. Sheriff Ballard brought up the rear. May saw them from the ledge ahead of time. She climbed down, stood by the path, and waited. Ballard approached her first, slightly ahead of the others, as if on purpose. "Hackett filed papers in the district court," he said quietly. "The hearing is in 4 days." A pause. "I'm just informing you." He stepped aside. The man in the brown suit stepped forward with a new sheet of paper. May took it and read it. A court summons to appear with documents confirming ownership of the building and the adjacent land. I believe Sheriff Ballard did more in that moment than he appeared to. He could have simply served the subpoena, no warning, no "I'm just informing you." Something in him had already begun to change. People who spend their lives choosing between their conscience and money sometimes break just like that, quietly, imperceptibly, in one short sotto voce sentence. She folded the summons and put it in her pocket. 4 days. She has the originals. Esther is ready to testify. 7 families saw the papers with their own eyes. May turned and walked back to the ledge. Ballard came the next morning, alone. Without deputies, without Hackett, without the man in the brown suit. He walked up the path slowly, like a man who'd been arguing with himself the whole way and arrived before the argument was over. May saw him from the window. She went out onto the porch and waited. He stopped at the bottom step. He took off his hat, not out of politeness, but simply held it in his hands, crumpling the brim with his fingers. There was no badge on his chest. May noticed this immediately. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Come in." He sat down by the stove, where Luther Crown usually sat on his first morning. May poured boiling water and placed the mug in front of him. He didn't take it right away. He stared at the fire. "Hackett pays me $20 a month," he said, "on top of my salary, for 7 years now." May said nothing. "It's not a bribe," he continued. "That's what he calls it, a consulting fee. I didn't do anything illegal for him. I just looked the other way when I needed to. I didn't ask questions." He finally picked up the mug. "That's probably worse." "Have you come to confess or to help?" May asked. Ballard looked at her, something akin to respect flickering in his gaze. "Help," he said. "If it's not too late." "It's not too late. Show me the papers." She took out the box. She laid out the receipts, the maps, and Murphy's letter in front of him. He read for a long time, unhurriedly, rereading individual passages, checking the maps. May sat across from him, silent. "Richard Murphy was my mother's brother," Ballard said, not looking up from his papers. "I knew he was hiding something. He told me once, hint-like, not outright, 'If anything happens to me, Esther will know.' I didn't go to Esther. I thought it was better not to know." "Why?" "Because I was already working for Hackett then." He paused. 7 years ago I thought $20 a month was just money, that it meant nothing. Then I realized it meant something. But I've gotten used to it." "I don't blame Ballard. It's easy to talk about conscience when you have a choice. He has a family. A sheriff's salary is a pittance, and a man who offers him $20 and asks only for silence. Most people in his position would have done the same. What amazes me is that at some point he finally came. Without guarantees, without profit. He just came. "What can you do?" May asked. Ballard straightened up. "You're not a lawyer," he said, "and you don't have the money for one. Hackett knows this. At the hearing, his man from Lexington will talk long and eloquently, while you'll be standing there with papers and not knowing how to present them properly. The court will rule in favor of the one who says the right words to the right person. I know. So you need someone who knows the words. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, blank, with the district court seal at the top. It's a lien holder's claim form, Section 214, Kentucky Code, 1909. If you file it before the hearing, Hackett's lawyer won't be able to just talk. He'll have to challenge the originals. And that's a different court, a different level, different deadlines. Hackett isn't prepared for the long game. He's used to quick decisions. May took the sheet of paper. She looked at the stamp and the blank lines. Have you brought the form already completed? Almost. Something flickered in the corners of his eyes. Your name still needs to be written. They worked until dark. Ballard dictated. May wrote, neatly, without blots, with the fountain pen he'd brought with him. The wording was precise and matter-of-fact, as befits a legal document. Holder of the original liens, date of death of the original creditor, expiration of the 10-year period. When they finished, Ballard took the statement, folded it, and put it in his inside pocket. I'll submit it in the morning, he said, personally, as the county sheriff. It's important, an official signature on the acceptance document. Hackett will find out. Yes. He stood up and put on his hat. I won't get $20 a month anymore. He was already walking towards the door when May said, Ballard. He stopped. Murphy wrote in his letter that he was in a different place on the day of the robbery, that you were a witness. Long pause. He was, he said quietly. I saw him here that morning. We talked. I didn't come to court. He didn't turn around. I'm wearing this, too. He went out. May looked at the closed door. It was quiet outside. The flood had receded, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and wet wood. Somewhere far below in the valley, the lights of Harlan City glowed. 3 days until the hearing. The hearing began at 10 in the morning. The Harlan City County Courthouse was designed to hold 30 people, but twice that number showed up. People lined the walls and sat on the windowsills. May recognized faces: the Crown brothers, Silas Horn, the Pratt family. The 7 who hadn't been on the ledge during the flood were also there, the remaining holders of the receipts, whom May had visited 2 days before the hearing, showing them their papers and explaining their findings. All 14 families were there. Hackett sat in the front row, wearing his wool coat. The lawyer from Lexington sat next to him, carrying a new briefcase. They were quietly conversing when May entered. The lawyer looked at her, then at Ballard, who had followed him in, and something in his expression changed slightly. He leaned toward Hackett and said a few words. Hackett didn't turn around. Judge Collins was old, dry, and, judging by the expression on his face, wanted to finish this case before lunch. The lawyer spoke first, long and beautifully, just as Ballard had warned. A convicted felon, seized property, county rights, legal procedure. The briefcase opened and closed. Papers landed on the judge's desk one after another. Then May stood up. She placed the statement under Article 214 on the table. Then the original receipts, all 14 of them, fanned out. Then Murphy's letter. Then the cards. The hall became quiet. Judge Collins took the first receipt. He looked at it. He took the second one. He looked at the lawyer over his glasses. Are these originals? He asked. Yes, Your Honor. Do you have the originals? That's for the lawyer. Pause. The briefcase opened, closed. We have notarized copies, Your Honor. Copies, the judge repeated. His tone was flat. He leafed through the receipts. Article 214 requires the original to be presented. Copies, even certified ones, are not sufficient to transfer the lien. That's the basics, Counselor. The lawyer began to speak, again beautifully, again at length. Judge Collins listened for about 3 minutes. Then he raised his hand. "I understand your position. Sit down." He looked over May's statement again, Murphy's letter. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Article 214, paragraph 3. In the presence of the original pledges and the expiration of a 10-year period from the death of the original holder, the right passes to the bearer of the originals. The period expired in 1922. The application was filed in October of 23. He put his glasses back on. "The application is granted." Hackett stood up. "Your Honor, I insist." "Sit down, Mr. Hackett," Judge Collins said, "or leave." After the hearing, Hackett approached May himself. No lawyer, no man in a brown suit. He simply came up and stood next to her while she folded the papers. The room was already dispersing. The Crown brothers stood by the exit. Edgar looked their way but didn't approach. "$30,000, Hackett said, "for all the paperwork, right now, cash." May fastened the drawstring on her tutu. "No." "40." "No." He paused. For the first time in her entire life, he didn't sound condescending. He simply looked like a tired, middle-aged man who hadn't quite made it. "Why?" he asked, not threateningly, but almost sincerely. "Because you'll take the money and come back again," May said. "Through a different bank, through a different person. In 5 years, these families will end up in the same place again." She looked at him. "Money talks today. Paperwork talks longer." Hackett looked at her for a second. Then he put on his hat and went out. That same evening, May gathered all 14 receipt holders in the courtroom. Judge Collins had given them an hour to stay after closing. She laid the receipts out on the table, each one facing the holder. "I'm canceling the debts," she said. "All 14 of them, completely." Silence. "In exchange, there are 2 conditions. First, 15% of the harvest every year for 10 years. Not from the sale of the land, only from the harvest. If the harvest is bad, pay less. If there is no harvest, don't pay. Second, if one of you decides to sell the plot, I have the right of first refusal. I'm not obligated to buy it. I just need to know first." John Featherstone's Appalachian Land Ownership Study, 1981, describes such agreements as community land covenants, informal agreements that emerged in the Appalachian Mountains after major economic crises. They were rarely legally formalized, but they persisted for decades, both verbally and through memory. Silas Horn was the first to extend his hand. "It's coming." Behind him is Edgar Crown, then the others, one after another. May could have taken $40,000. For an 18-year-old girl who had nothing 4 months ago, it wasn't just money, it was a different life. She refused. I think she understood what Hackett never did. A land where no one stands will always find a new Hackett. She chose to stand. The ashes of the old saloon burned down that same night. No one knew who started the fire. Maybe it was an accident, maybe not. May stood by the fire, papers in her hands, and Hackett told her about the 30,000, and she said, "I know." This was after the trial, after the agreement with the 14 families. Hackett made one last attempt, not by threat, not by force. Just money, the last thing he had left. May said, "I know," and nothing more. Sheriff Bollard stood 3 steps away looking at the fire. "What next?" he asked quietly. "Next comes spring," May said. "Sowing." The ashes were silent. But in her pocket lay Murphy's maps, all 4 sheets, and 9 crosses on the slopes that she hadn't yet told anyone about. That was for later. A year has passed. October 1924 was dry and golden, the kind of October that happens in the mountains every few years, when summer slowly slips away, leaving behind 2 weeks of warm, windless weather. May sat on the porch of the cabin with a mug and looked out over the valley. Chimneys smoked below. Edgar Crown rebuilt the lower house, a new one, slightly higher than the old one, taking into account the flood mark. Silas Horn built a new barn. Young Kettering gave birth to a son in November, named Richard. May learned of this from Esther and didn't say anything out loud, simply remembered. The garden near the hut yielded more than she expected this year: potatoes, beans, and pumpkins. The roof survived the winter without a single leak. She didn't have time to re-roof the stove, she just sealed it. But the crack on the right side didn't widen, and the draft was good. This was her home, not because she paid $2 for it, not because the court upheld her right, but because she'd repaired every board here with her own hands, and knew where the floor creaked, and remembered the smell of the first morning when she walked in here with a canvas bag and a pencil stub. Esther Pine arrived at noon, as she did every week, unannounced, carrying something. This time a jar of honey and an old book with a tattered cover. "I found it on my shelf," she said, handing over the book. "I think you need it more." It was a 1908 edition of the Kentucky Land Code. Pencil marks were in the margins. The handwriting was masculine and confident. "Him?" May asked. "Him," Esther said. May flipped through several pages. Murphy underlined articles, added question marks, and occasionally scribbled short notes in the margins. Article 214 was underlined twice and circled. He knew this law by heart. He planned everything. "He was a smart man," May said. "He was a fair man," Esther corrected. "That's not the same thing." They sat on the porch drinking tea with honey, and May thought about this difference. A smart man would have found a way to win himself while he was still alive. A just man would have hidden the tools for someone who hadn't yet arrived. Ballard arrived in the evening. He no longer worked for Hackett. The whole county knew it. Hackett left Harlan City in January, having sold what little remained after the court ruling through a broker. No one particularly saw him off. Ballard remained sheriff. The county council re-elected him unanimously in March, which was a surprise to everyone, including himself. He stopped his horse at the side of the path without climbing onto the ledge. "May. The inspector from Frankfurt is coming next week. He wants to look at Murphy's maps, those 9 crosses." "I know." "Are you ready?" "Ready." Ballard nodded. Then he paused slightly. "He says there are coal seams there, good ones. Companies from the north will offer money." "I know. Big money." "Ballard," May said, "you want to ask if I'll sell?" He paused. "Yes." "No." She looked at the valley. "Not because the money is bad, but because Murphy didn't sell, and he was right. Coal companies take the land, scoop it up, and walk away. We've seen that before, further north. I'd rather wait." "What?" "Until I find a way to keep the land here." She turned to him. "There has to be a way." Ballard looked at her for a second. Then he chuckled, not mockingly, but rather with the respect one gets when someone says something simple and precise. "I suppose I should," he said, and he started his horse down the trail. In the evening, May took out the box for the last time. Not the papers, she knew them by heart. She pulled out what had been lying beneath the papers, beneath the oily rag, at the very bottom, a brass button with an anchor. Not the one she'd found on the floor the first day, another one, exactly the same. There were 2 of them. One she'd found on the floor, the other was in the box. Murphy had placed it there himself. Why, she didn't know. Perhaps it was simply a memory of something. Perhaps a sign that this man had once been somewhere by the sea and seen something greater than mountains and deaths and an unjust trial. She put both buttons in the tin box and closed it. Then she stood up, went out onto the porch and called, "Esther?" The old woman peeked out from around the corner. She hadn't gone home, she stayed to weed the garden. "Take it." May handed her the box. He deserved to have this with someone who knew him. Esther took the box in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "Will you keep the receipts?" "Yes, they are still needed." "And the cards?" "Cards too." Esther nodded. She tucked the box under her apron and walked down the path, small, dry in the gathering dusk. The sky above the ridge darkened in the east, first blue, then almost black, with the first stars. Lights were coming on in the valley below. Smoke from the chimneys rose vertically, meaning there was no wind, meaning the night would be calm. May thought about what Murphy had written in the letter. "Do with it what you will, but know this. These families did not lose their land because they were bad farmers, because they were unlucky with the year." A bad year. Such a simple yet terrifying statement. A whole life, an entire household, 3 generations of labor, and one bad year can ruin it all if you're surrounded by someone with money and no conscience. Murphy found a way for one man to counter this. Not with force, not with money, with knowledge, with the law, with papers hidden in the right place, waiting for the right person. She wasn't sure she was the right person. She just happened to be in the right place, with $2 in her pocket. Maybe that's enough. Nature is cyclical. Floods return, droughts return, and people like Hackett return too, in different coats, with different lawyers, with different papers. This isn't pessimism, just the kind of calculus Murphy knew and May now knew. But some things keep repeating. People who hide the truth in the right place. People who buy a rotten shack for their last $2. People who walk up to the sheriff without a badge and say, "I want to help." This too is returning, just quieter than a flood. If this story about how the truth doesn't disappear but only waits beneath rotten boards resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments, was there someone in your life who helped you at the most unexpected moment, like Esther helped May, or like Bollard came without a badge? Whether it's just a name or a story, we read everyone. See you in the next story. And remember, home isn't about walls. It's about what you're willing to fight for.